Welcome back to another episode of the Eniqma. Today we will read some true unexplainable stories I found on Reddit that I think you guys will enjoy. All the posts that I will read today are listed in the description box. If you have any videos or stories that you think are interesting, share them with me in the comment section below. Without further ado, let's begin with today's episode. So, this happened to my mom when she was 14. My mom and her stepdad were watching TV one day when all of a sudden, they hear the family dog freaking out, like barking its head off. My mom took a look outside and doesn't see anyone and dismisses it as the dog being erratic. An hour later, my mom head upstairs to go to bed, and upon reaching the top floor, she notices the light in her room was on. Growing up, she is used to being pranked by her brothers. She assumed that they were in her room doing something nefarious. She opened the door, preparing to tell her brother to get out of her room, but instead was met with a horrifying sight. Everything in her room was upside down, and on her bed was a disheveled woman who was dressed in my mother's clothes. She turned her head to see who entered the room, and upon seeing my mother, she said, "I'm going to kill you." She lunged at my mother with a pair of clothing scissors, but luckily, my mother managed to get out of there and alerted her stepdad. He did not believe her at first, but eventually, they called the police. Long story short, the woman had escaped from the local asylum and had sneaked past my mom and her stepdad that night. When I was in elementary, I went to school ridiculously early for swimming practice. Turns out it was cancelled that day, and I only found out when I got there. That meant that I had the school to myself. I waited near the school gate and, soon enough, my homeroom teacher arrived. I greeted her, saying, "Hi, Miss Grace." And this is where it gets weird. She ignored me and walked past me. I was so confused. I looked towards the gate, then back at where she was walking, but she wasn't there. I was a bit spooked at this point, so I went outside my locked classroom, which happens to be next to the restroom. I sat down on the floor, and a few minutes later, I heard the eeriest, creepiest laughter coming from the restroom. It was really high-pitched, almost witch-like. It made my hair stand on end. I was so scared I ran back towards the school gate. A few minutes later, my homeroom teacher, who ignored me and walked past me earlier, went through the gate again. But this time, she saw me and greeted me. I was too freaked out to reply, so I just stood there, staring at her. To this day, I still don't have any idea what really happened. It's the only paranormal experience I haven't been able to explain. My mom's whole side of the family was raised Catholic. All went to the same church in a small town in the south. I was there one summer as a kid with my mom when I was around 10 years old. My uncle's farmland backs right up to the church, and things haven't been going so well on the farm one day. Crops were not growing right, healthy animals randomly dropping dead, chickens and small creatures showing up gutted even though he had a donkey to protect his cattle. Just weird stuff that's never happened before. So one day, the adults were acting super weird and cagey. You know how they act when something big is going down but they don't want to scare the kids? Like that. My grandma, mother, uncle, aunt, some older cousins and the priest, and another man from the church are all hanging out on my uncle's farm, and they basically kicked me out of the house to go to play. Naturally, being a very curious kid, I climb as high as I can in the nearest tree to the house, trying to eavesdrop. I hear a snippet of conversation here and there but can't figure out what they're up to. Everyone leaves the house, following the priest to the barn, stables, chicken coop, etc. This entire time, I'm watching from the tree. While they're all down at the stables, I hear the door to the house open, and a woman I've never seen before, maybe in her 30s with brown hair and a blue dress, casually walks out of the door. She briefly looks up at me in the tree. I waved, but she ignored me and walked off down the dirt road. Once the adults are done with whatever they're doing, we all gather in the dining room of my uncle's house to have some lemonade my aunt made because it was such a warm day. I decided to pipe up and ask them who the woman in the blue dress was, since I'd never seen her visit before. Every adult in the room freaks out. My aunt starts crying. The priest looks like he might barf. I was only told that the woman was just visiting. A decade later is when my uncle finally tells me that the woman I saw was an apparition that had started appearing to parishioners at the church and next door on my uncle's land. They assumed she was a lost spirit trying to pass on, but after she attacked the priest at his house, also nearby, and farm animals started showing up dead, they decided she was some sort of a demon who appeared as a young woman to hide her true nature. The day I saw her from the tree, the adults had gotten permission from the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism on my uncle's land. It appears I witnessed her leaving. I wonder where she was going though. Now I'm 26 years old, and the story of Evelyn, which the parishioners started calling her, who had been spotted inside the church, still gives me goosebumps. I remember she was completely expressionless when she looked up at me in that tree. The moment she was gone, the crops started recovering and we stopped finding dead and eviscerated livestock. I'm not religious and I'm generally a pretty big skeptic, but I'll never be able to explain what I saw from the oak tree that day. This one isn't super exciting, just weird. My grandma was always irrationally afraid of dogs. She liked them, but they made her nervous because they were too messy and loud and unpredictable. She would always tell us not to leave the door open on nice days. Close that door, a big black dog might walk in. She had this fear that one day she would turn around and there would be a big black labrador slobbering on her floors. We always laugh at her oddly specific fear, and we knew everyone who lived nearby and their dogs. The biggest, blackest dog within 1 mile of her house was a Yorkie, so her fear was unfounded. Anyway, years later, my grandma passed away. My dad and I had the sad task of clearing out her house. Things were a bit stuffy, so we left the door open to the yard and got to work. After a while, we both hear a strange noise and looked up. It sounded like panting. We turned around and, I kid you not, there was a big black Labrador sitting in the middle of the kitchen, just gazing up at us happily, drooling on Grandma's linoleum, just like she always said would happen. We lost it. We started laughing uncontrollably and cried a little. We gave the dog scratches and escorted him back outside. My dad shut the door, looked upwards and said, "Sorry, Ma, you were right."